This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Saturday, the 3rd of February. I'm Jackie Leonard with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, the US Congress has released a controversial Republican memo alleging the FBI abused its surveillance powers during the election campaign.
A lot of people should be ashamed of themselves, and much worse than that.
Leading Democrats say President Trump risks provoking a constitutional crisis. We'll hear from Washington. Our defence correspondent will be looking at the news that the US military wants to develop new low-yield nuclear weapons to counter the threat posed by Russia. The Polish Prime Minister has defended a law to punish references implying Poland was complicit in Nazi crimes. He says his compatriots were overwhelmingly victims.
Holocaust denial is not only denial of German crimes, but also other ways of falsifying history. We want to fight against this lie in its every form.
Also, the lonely life of Nigel, the New Zealand gannet. We begin, though, in Washington, where there's been strong reaction to the publishing of a controversial Republican intelligence memo which accuses the FBI of abusing its powers. The Republican Matt Gaetz says the 4-page document showed clear Democrat bias against Donald Trump by the FBI in its investigations into alleged Russian ties to the president during the 2016 election campaign.
To my knowledge, this is the first time in American history that the FBI and Justice Department have been weaponized through the actions of a political party, of the DNC paying the Perkins law firm to pay Christopher Steele and Nellie Orr to get this information converted from a political opposition research document into an intelligence document.
But Democrat Congressman Steve Cohen says the release of the memo was clearly designed to protect the president.
Trump will do anything to protect himself. He is not for the American system of government, for democracy, for transparency, for due process, the rule of law, and justice. He is evil. The truth sometimes has to be said. President
Trump says the FBI's conduct has been disgraceful.
I think it's a disgrace what's happening in our country. And when you look at that, and you see that, and so many other things, what's going on, a lot of people should be ashamed of themselves, and much worse than that.
So does the memo's content live up to expectations? Our reporter in Washington is Anthony Zerka.
Well, it's pretty much what it was rumored to be. I mean, the memo alleges that an essential part of the warrant issued in October 2016 to surveil Carter Page, and he was a volunteer foreign policy advisor of the Trump campaign, that it was based on this now infamous Christopher Steele dossier. And whether you think it lives up to the hype or not, I guess it depends on whether you think that the evidence in the memo saying that Steele's efforts were funded in part by Democrats, that he had been leaking information to the press, or that he had expressed some anti-Trump views, whether that was enough to undermine the warrant and consequently the entire Russia investigation. I mean, the Trump team himself said that Carter Page was a bit player, and the warrant was approved until October 2016, which is after the FBI had already opened their investigation.
We heard the president there saying that people should be ashamed of themselves and worse. Are we expecting anyone to resign or be fired?
Well, there were a lot of eyes on Christopher Wray, who is the current FBI director who replaced James Comey, who Donald Trump fired last year. There doesn't seem to be any indication that Wray is going anywhere. Another one who was in the spotlight was Rod Rosenstein, the deputy attorney general, who was involved in improving these surveillance warrants for Carter Page. And it was kind of interesting. Attorney General Jeff Sessions earlier today in a public speech with Rosenstein on stage with him said that Rosenstein represents the kind of quality leadership that we won in the department. So it doesn't sound like his job is in danger. But I guess the question will be, where does Donald Trump go from here? And if he tries to make any moves on people in his own Department of Justice, or say Robert Mueller, who's leading the special investigation into Russia-Trump campaign possible ties.
Well, yes. Where does this leave the investigation into alleged Russian collusion?
Well, it seems like the whole premise of this memo and what Republicans are making it out to be is that it's the Russia investigation as embodied in Robert Mueller's work is fruit of a poison tree, that there was bias from the very start. And so that's going to filter down to Mueller's investigation. I think it muddies the waters, certainly. But whether it's going to disrupt Mueller at all, if Donald Trump doesn't try to fire him, then I think he's probably going to keep on grinding away in his work.
That was Anthony Zerka in Washington. The United States has proposed extending its nuclear capabilities to meet new challenges. The Pentagon says the US military wants to develop new low-yield atomic bombs in direct response to the threat posed by Russia. My colleague Claire McDonnell got more from our defence and diplomatic correspondent, Jonathan Marcus.
Well, this is Mr. Trump's stamp, if you like, on America's nuclear weapons policy. It essentially stems from a broader shift in American military strategy, which is to see a much more threatening world, a world where the principal campaigns are not simply against insurgents or against terrorists in far-flung places, but potentially against peer competitors, as they call them, the need to deter Russia, China, potential future nuclear worries from North Korea, maybe even one day Iran. That is the sort of essential context in all of this, and what they're saying effectively is that they need to have more tools in the toolbox, if you like, to be able to give a tailored kind of deterrence. The idea is not to fight nuclear wars, but basically to deter them by having a larger range of tools in the nuclear toolbox.
How are they going about this? Are we talking new weapons? And how do they come up with the ideas for these new weapons? Do they look at what other people have got? Is that how it works?
They clearly believe that the Russians and the Chinese are modernizing significantly, which they are, but of course the Americans are modernizing their forces too. Russia is seen as having made explicit threats of nuclear targeting against particular NATO countries, for example, if they participate in the American anti-ballistic missile systems and so on. Russia is clearly seen by NATO countries, at least, to be in breach of a number of key arms control treaties. And also Russian military doctrine seems to be evolving and to be putting more weight upon the idea of using smaller nuclear weapons almost as a war-ending weapon in a smaller localized conflict in which the Americans are hardly likely to put Washington at risk or to threaten Moscow if a much smaller conflict had broken out. Two particular things they want to develop. One is basically a low-yield warhead on their existing submarine-launched ballistic missiles. That basically means that they take some warheads off them, adapt them, make them less powerful, so they would have less destructive power, but we shouldn't run away with the idea these are still hugely destructive. The other weapon they're thinking of bringing back into the American arsenal is a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. So that, in a sense, they believe will give them this range of flexible options and, as it were, deter an enemy from using nuclear weapons at every single point in the escalatory scale.
Critics may say developing all these new weapons does nothing to deter the proliferation across the globe.
Well, there's been an awful lot of criticism from sort of the arms control lobby, disarmament experts, not least because the bulk of this document was leaked about 10 days ago, and so they've had an awful lot of time to look at it. At one basic level, people say, well, the idea of having low-yield, less destructive weapons is all very well, but when somebody shoots a nuclear missile at you, you don't know what's on board, you don't know if it's a big one or a small one, and you respond to an attack. Therefore, that idea of a graded response is perhaps not terribly logical. Other people say that these classes of weapons have not been in the American arsenal for over a decade and that they're just not needed, that the scale of the nuclear threat can be covered by existing weapons.
Jonathan Marcus. Police in Tehran have arrested 29 women on suspicion of public order offences after they appeared in public without headscarves. In recent years, women have increasingly flouted Iran's rules on clothing and have often let their headscarves fall about their necks. But this latest campaign of civil disobedience has rattled the authorities, as Kazra Naji of BBC Persian Service reports.
The women, known as the Girls of the Revolution Street, have got everyone talking. Many have taken to standing alone on boxes or steps on busy streets, waving their headscarves on a stick. Their pictures and videos have gone viral on social media. The campaign started in Tehran but soon spread to provincial centres. Their peaceful but public protests appear to have attracted widespread support amongst ordinary people, even among women who normally and willingly wear the hijab. Tehran's chief prosecutor has called the campaign trivial, childish, and possibly encouraged by Iran's enemies abroad. But it is clear that at a time of growing discontent in Iran on the eve of the 39th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, the authorities are facing a new challenge from an unexpected quarter.
Kazra Naji of the BBC Persian Service. Mayan ruins abound in Guatemala, and these ancient structures, often obscured in dense jungle, stand as testament to the architectural skills and advanced design concepts employed by the Mayan civilization more than 1,000 years ago. Researchers have now found more than 60,000 previously hidden Mayan ruins using laser technology called LIDAR, and they're describing the find as one of the greatest advances in over 150 years of Mayan archaeology. One of those involved in the project is Thomas Garrison, assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology at Ithaca College in the US, and he spoke to my colleague Julian Marshall.
The most important thing about this survey is the scale of it, because when we think about the Maya, we still have this idea of them being this lost civilization, sort of shrouded in mystery in the jungle. You know, there's a certain romanticism to it for sure. The fact is that we know an awful lot about the Maya, but what the LIDAR does is it really gives us a complete picture of how they were living in this landscape in a way that's unprecedented, not only for the Maya, but pretty much any ancient civilization, because in many regions of the world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, the ancient Greeks and Romans, you have all of the modern stuff that we're doing today that obscures all but the most important sort of preserved, valued ruins. And here we have the jungle preserving the total landscape of an ancient civilization in a way that we've never seen before.
And it proves to be more comprehensive, more extensive, the civilization than previously thought?
Absolutely, and in many different ways. In the sheer number of individual structures we see in the landscape, it increases exponentially how many people were probably living in this landscape. Without putting a specific number on it, I'd say we're talking about 3 or 4 times larger than what we would have previously imagined. And then much more connected. We see road systems running through the area. We see extensive agricultural fields because people needed to feed this huge population. These are all really, really subtle features that we sort of knew that the Maya had because of chance discoveries, but the LIDAR shows us all of it.
So what's the picture? What's the overall picture that you now have of that Mayan civilization? I mean, you've already referred to it as being more extensive than previously thought. I mean, it didn't cover, did it, the entire landmass of what is now Guatemala?
Well, it's interesting you say that because there are differences in the different polygons that we shot. But for example, in the very northern part of Guatemala, right near the border with Mexico, where a French project is working at a site called Nachtun, the LIDAR data in the region surrounding their site, there's not a single piece of elevated terrain that isn't covered with some sort of ancient Maya settlement. But from my own perspective, my piece of the data near where I work at a site called El Zotes, we have this incredible number of defensive features. Warfare and conflict was what sort of defined this region, including a brand new site that we can only describe as a fortress, which isn't something that we really think of with the Maya.
So what's next? Down to ground level and start digging?
Yeah. So because of the number of scholars that are involved here and the huge area that's covered, everyone's LIDAR data has different amazing things in it that are sort of dictating our research. So, for example, I'm writing a lot of grants with my colleagues to look into these defensive features and fortresses and see if we can raise the funds to really do a serious excavation and actually figure out what those are about. We see this LIDAR data set as being this stepping stone to totally new questions about the Maya that over the next many decades are going to really change our view of them, because we're not spending all of our time in the field thrashing around just trying to look to see where they are. We now know that. So what can we do now?
Thomas Garrison. The Sri Lankan government and the British High Commission in Colombo have issued a joint statement saying a document listing 18 rules for greeting British royals was fake, but only after it had gone viral on social media. Alice Porter has more.
When it comes to greeting royalty, it's easy to feel unsure of the correct protocol to follow. The Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward, and his wife Sophie are currently visiting Sri Lanka on behalf of Queen Elizabeth to mark Sri Lanka's 70th anniversary of independence on Sunday. And it seemed help was at hand for the many Sri Lankans who hoped to meet them, in the form of a handy guide to the correct etiquette to be employed. The instructions said the royals shouldn't be looked at directly, shouldn't be photographed without permission, and most certainly shouldn't be touched. That, it said, amounted to a criminal offence. The document also warned that those who didn't follow the royal greeting etiquette could be arrested. The only problem was that the document was a fake. Many Sri Lankans, including politicians, journalists and former diplomats, shared it online, making angry comments, saying the guide harkened back to colonial times. It's now one of the most circulated documents ever on social media in the country, and it prompted the British High Commission in Sri Lanka to join forces with the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry to release a statement dismissing the letter and denying that they'd had anything to do with it. Many who fell for the fake letter removed their posts from social media, but some still argued that the letter was real and that it was only withdrawn because of criticism. But even without the fuss over the fake protocol, the royal trip hasn't gone entirely without embarrassment. Earlier in the week, an official Sri Lankan government letter referred to Prince Edward as the Duck of Edinburgh, which would certainly push the boundaries of any etiquette guide.
That was Alice Porter. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And remember that every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's In the World This Week. The programme is also available to download from our website. At least 90 migrants are presumed to have drowned after an overloaded boat capsized off the western coast of Libya on its way to Italy on Thursday night. Most on board are thought to be from Pakistan, but a Libyan woman has also been found among the dead. As we record this podcast, just 3 survivors have been rescued. All this is happening as changes come into force in how migrants are rescued. This could affect the Mediterranean island of Malta. The Maltese ambassador to Rome, Vanessa Frazier, spoke to us about the latest migrant tragedy.
Well, unfortunately, the information is quite sparse, but from what we have heard, and it still all needs to be verified, we're not sure if they were in a wooden boat or in a rubber dinghy, but normally for that size, 90 people, it could be that was a rubber dinghy, but we don't know yet. And that it happened yesterday evening, and that this boat departed with a few others, and the others were intercepted by Libyan Coast Guard.
Now, the International Organisation for Migration says that the numbers this year are already up. The EU border agency Frontex has changed its rules. Previously, people being picked up in the Mediterranean were sent to Italy. So how is all of this going to affect Malta?
We really do not think that the focus should be on the disembarkation. And it's quite surprising, actually, that this is really what has been picked up. For us, what the concern of the new operation is that the operational area has changed and has moved drastically north. And so this would mean that there are more lives that are going to be risked at sea. And for us, Frontex operation and any operation at sea should have a priority, which is the preservation of lives. So especially in the winter months, we feel that the operational area should be closer to where the migrants find themselves in problems.
What does Malta want done to deal with the people who risk their lives, as you say, in the sea off Libya?
Well, the migrants need to be saved if they are at sea. Ideally, and what a lot has been done over the last few years at many levels, ideally is to tackle the root causes, to stop them from risking their lives. That people, migrants wishing to seek a better future in Europe are sorted there, and legal routes of migration are provided for them, because the only way to save lives really at sea is to stop them from taking to the sea in the first place.
Vanessa Frazier, the Maltese ambassador to Rome. The Israeli embassy in Warsaw says it's faced a wave of anti-Semitic statements amid a row over a Polish law on the Holocaust. The comments come after the Polish parliament passed legislation to outlaw suggestions that Poland is responsible for some of the crimes committed by the Nazis. 2 million Poles were killed during the war, and the Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, says the country's Holocaust victims shouldn't bear responsibility for crimes committed against them.
Holocaust denial is not only denial of German crimes, but also other ways of falsifying history. One of the worst types of this lie occurs when someone diminishes the responsibility of real perpetrators and attributes that responsibility to their victims. We want to fight against this lie in its every form. This is why we are amending the law of the Institute of National Remembrance.
The legislation, yet to be ratified by the president, has caused a diplomatic rift with Israel and has been condemned by the International Council of the Auschwitz Museum. Our correspondent Adam Easton in Warsaw told us what the Israeli embassy was reporting.
They've just said they call these statements overflowing on the internet online. But they also singled out the public broadcaster's 24-hour news channel, which mainstream media also engaging what it calls anti-Semitic statements. There's been a couple of incidents where Polish journalists, columnists were perceived to be making jokes, anti-Semitic jokes on the channel recently, and also one debate show where a Jewish member actually walked off the debate because he was upset with the way the debate was proceeding. So the embassy has also said that some of the statements, these anti-Semitic statements, have been addressed personally at the ambassador herself.
And the Auschwitz Museum has also voiced its concerns. What are they?
They are essentially the concerns that are shared by the United States and the Israeli government, that this bill, because if its regulations, it says, are so imprecise that it raises legitimate concerns that Holocaust research could be restricted if this bill becomes law. And it said we've been fighting for years against the lie, the phrase Polish death camps, but it said we've been watching this dispute over this bill with utmost concern.
And is this row affecting Polish society at large?
Well, we can already see it's not just the Israeli embassy. I've been told by the head of the Jewish community in Warsaw that she's also noticed a spike in anti-Semitic incidents, and it's certainly, everybody is talking about it, whether people are disappointed with the way the government is trying to approach this issue, or whether they really are angry at the furious reaction of the Israelis. But everybody's got an opinion about this.
Adam Easton in Warsaw. Every year, thousands of young children in China are stolen from their families and sold to strangers. Many never see their parents again. Now the leader of a major child trafficking network has been sentenced to death, and many others in the 25-strong gang have been given long jail sentences. Our Asia-Pacific editor Celia Hatton has been looking at the case.
This gang was responsible for stealing children mainly from Yunnan province, which is in southwest China. It's a very poor, very rural province, and they were sold off in Guangdong, which is in China's industrial heart. There's a lot of movement. It's easy for people to pass through relatively unnoticed. So this gang had been doing this for quite a few years, it's thought.
Now, this is one gang, but it's a widespread problem, isn't it?
It's a massive problem in China. The government admits itself that between 2009 and 2012, it had an operation cracking down on child trafficking gangs. In that 3-year period, they caught 9,000 gangs. They don't actually release the numbers of how many kids are thought to be trafficked. And I think that's really because they don't actually know. There's no central government bureau that really tracks the welfare of children. But estimates are up to around 200,000 children a year. So those are children who are snatched from their families or sometimes sold by their families. Sometimes they're bought to be part of begging gangs. So gang members will buy up children and then force those children to go on the streets to beg for money because it's thought that children will get more money than adults who are begging for money. There are also families who want to buy baby boys because they already have a girl in their family. It's often thought that a family is incomplete unless there's a boy to carry on the family name. And so a family who's in that belief might go and buy a boy. Also, sometimes baby girls are bought by families who basically want to buy a future bride for their son. She can serve in the household, the thinking goes, and then when she's a bit older, she can be married to one of the sons and then bear children. Because it's quite expensive for poor families to fund and to pay a girl's family, basically what amounts to a dowry.
What sort of reaction has there been to this case in China?
A lot of the parents whose children were trafficked by this gang say that the sentences were just far too low. That, yes, the gang leader was given a death sentence, but it was a suspended death sentence. That means if he serves 2 years in prison and is on good behavior, the sentence will probably be changed to life in prison. And these parents are saying, look, they made huge profits off of every child that they sold. The children were sold between 12 and 15,000 US dollars per child. And so this gang operated for years and really ripped apart dozens of families. On a wider scale, there are so many unregistered children in China who are born outside of the two-child policy, who are born outside of any government registration system, that it's really difficult for Chinese officials at the very top to be able to track when a child is stolen and where that child ends up.
That was Celia Hatton. New Zealand says it's going to protect struggling home buyers from the excesses of global capitalism with a ban on foreigners purchasing existing properties. The new Trade Minister, David Parker, says the move will help an insecure middle class that has been sold out to the super wealthy. The legislation is expected to be passed in the next few months. It aims to dampen runaway house prices that have squeezed many Kiwis out of the market. Critics of the measure say it will affect a small part of the property sector and won't improve affordability. From Wellington, Phil Mercer reports.
It's expensive. I don't know if I'll ever be able to buy a house. I want to.
We're going to crack down on foreign ownership of New Zealand's homes and farms, essentially. We think it's the birthright of people who live and pay tax in your country to have first dibs on your property.
In Wellington, prices soared by more than 18% in the year to June 2017.
It was basically making those hard choices whether make our family larger, have another child, or try and get a house, because you can't really do both at the same time. It's a bit hard.
I look at my children and my family and friends' children, and I really, really feel for them, because I just believe the market has made it impossible for them to get into the housing.
The government wanting to restrict foreign ownership, what do you think of that?
I don't see it's going to make too much difference. They'll find a different way to buy it.
Yep, I agree.
And while it's true that the great majority of New Zealanders do have a roof over their heads, it's increasingly the case that it's one that they're renting, because the cost of buying a home has risen far beyond their reach.
A recent documentary has highlighted the problem. 25 years ago, 3/4 of Kiwis lived in their own homes. Now it's 64% and falling. Low interest rates, limited supply and immigration have driven up house prices. Restricting foreign ownership of residential property has been tried in other countries.
I'm Norman Gamble. I'm the Chair in Public Finance at Victoria University in Wellington. Switzerland's probably one of the classic examples of pretty much banning any foreign ownership of domestic property. So there is a sensible economic argument that says if lots of foreign investors, because there's money slewing around in the world looking for a good home, if lots of these foreign investors are looking to put their cash into New Zealand, if it then forces up the price of property so that people can't afford to live anymore, you should think about what's the right way to allocate your domestic housing stock.
Critics insist that foreign investors have had only a small impact on the cost of property. But New Zealand's Trade Minister David Parker says the restrictions aren't just about price, but fairness.
We think that some of the difficulties that are rising in politics around the world are driven by an insecurity of middle-class citizens in their own country who feel that their interests are being sold out to the interests of this super wealthy cohort.
New Zealand's Trade Minister David Parker ending that report from Phil Mercer. And we will stay in New Zealand for our final, rather sad story. A lonely gannet who lived his life above the cliffs of an uninhabited island has been found dead alongside his partner, a concrete replica bird. 80 of the decoys were placed on the island in the hope of attracting real birds to form a breeding colony. Linda Kirkmeester from Friends of Manor Island says Nigel No Mates has been seen by volunteers carefully courting his supposed mate.
His girlfriend was one of those stony birds, and they were all different forms. They're very realistic. He actually built a nest for her. We've got a beautiful video of him preening her, like very gently stroking her face and trying to get her onto this nest, and even seen in the actual act of mating her, which gave us no doubt that he was actually a boy. The great thing was that we had 3 more birds come back very recently. Towards the end of last year, we saw 3 other birds, but they were in a different part of the colony, and they didn't seem to want to have anything to do with Nigel and his girl. So that was a bit sad, but also hopeful, because we don't know whether they're all males or, a mixture. So perhaps Nigel did have some impact because he may have attracted those birds.
Poor Nigel. That was Linda Kirkmeester. And that's it from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download tomorrow, Sunday. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk, or if you're on Twitter, just use the hashtag #GlobalNewsPod. I'm Jackie Leonard, and until next time, goodbye.